Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. Put this stuff on my lips and it tastes like sweet. Anyway, guys didn't need to know all of that. Before the strikes, there was quiet. Not peace, not stability, quiet. The kind produced by fear, hunger, and exhaustion. In the early 1970s, apartheid South Africa depended on one thing more than any other: Black labor that did not speak. This episode begins before the walkout, before the slogans, before the wage demands, before the shock. By 1973, Durban had become one of the most important industrial centers in South Africa. It port-fed global trade, its factories processed goods for export, and its labor force powered growth. But the system was built on deliberate imbalance. Black workers earned poverty wages, the perfect way to put it, if I must say so myself. They lived in hostels or informal settlements and had no recognized unions. They could be fired, arrested, or deported at will. As documented in the Durban Strikes archive, many workers earned less than 10 Rand a week, supporting entire families under past law control. This was not accidental. Cheap labor was apartheid's foundation. The violence workers experienced was not always spectacular. It was routine. Unsafe machinery, long hours, verbal abuse, racial hierarchy enforced daily. A former textile worker later recalled, "You work knowing you could lose your job for looking wrong at a supervisor. That fear stayed in your body. This fear was meant to discipline. But over time, it produced something else: resentment. Black workers were not unorganized because they were incapable. They were unorganized because organization was illegal. Registered trade unions were restricted to white workers. Black unions were denied legal recognition. Meetings could be banned. Yet, informally, organization existed. Workers talked in hostels, on buses, in churches, during lunch breaks. Of course they do. These conversations mattered. They created understanding long before action. By the early 1970s, a new language was circulating quietly. It did not come from political parties. It came from ideas. Black consciousness, which we spoke about in the last episode, emphasize dignity, self-worth, and psychological liberation. Workers absorbed this language indirectly. They began to speak differently about themselves, not as labor units, but as people. The shift did not produce strikes immediately. It produced confidence. Durban was uniquely volatile. Why? Concentrated industry, migrant labor hostels, extreme wage inequality, and close proximity between factories. So information traveled fast between them, and so did anger. By late 1972, small stoppages and complaints were increasing, and the management dismissed it. The state ignored it. The system mistook endurance for acceptance. On the evening of January 1973, nothing appeared broken. Factories were running. Ships were docking. Workers reported for duty. But beneath the routine, had reached its limit. On the morning of the 9th of January 1973, workers at Coronation Brick and Tile Company reported for duty as usual. They clocked in. They stood at their stations. The machines began to run. And then, without a whistle, without a speech, they stopped. No slogans were shouted. No placards were raised. The machines fell silent. The silence carried further than any chant. Coronation Brick was not a political site. It was not symbolic. It was ordinary. And that was the point. The strike did not begin with activists or union leaders. It began with workers calculating the cost of living and realizing the numbers did not add up. Their demand was simple: a living wage, nothing more, nothing less. One of the most striking features of the walkout was its discipline. Workers did not riot. They did not damage property. They did not confront management violently. They gathered, they talked, they waited. Management expected chaos. Instead, they found order. This confused both employers and police because order without permission was something apartheid had no script for. Word traveled fast, as you could see. By the second day, workers at a nearby factory walked out. Dock workers stopped unloading. Textile workers followed. There was no central command. The strike spread through proximity, conversation, and example. One worker later explained, "When we heard they had stopped and were not arrested, we knew we could also stop." Fear had been punctured. Factory owners responded unevenly. Some threatened dismissal, some called the police, some attempted negotiation. They were used to disobedience, not dialogue. What unsettled them most was the calm. A strike that did not look like rebellion could not be easily crushed. Police were hesitant. There was no clear crime. The apartheid state faced a dilemma. Arresting thousands of workers risk shutting down the economy. Ignoring them risk encouraging imitation. So the state hesitated. This hesitation mattered. It taught workers something crucial: that the state's power had limits. The absence of violence was not accidental. Workers understood instinctively violence would justify repression, calm would force engagement. They policed themselves, they discouraged provocation. This restraint would later become a template for mass resistance. Striking workers were not alone. Families shared food, churches opened spaces, communities protected gatherings. This support transformed the strike from an economic action into a social one. The strike was no longer about wages alone. It was about dignity. Under pressure, some employees conceded. Wages were raised, not dramatically, but enough to signal vulnerability. This was unprecedented. For the first time in decades, Black workers had forced concessions without legal unions. The lesson spread faster than the strike itself. Publicly, the government downplayed the strikes. Privately, officials were alarmed. Internal discussions focused on one issue: organization without leaders was difficult to neutralize. There was no names to ban. There was no offices to raid. This insight would haunt the state for years. By late January, many workers had returned to, but nothing returned to normal. The workers had learned their labor had power, unity reduced fear, and discipline protected them. The state had learned something too, that repression was not always the answer. Sure, they were horrified by that, and that was dangerous. The Durban strike did not overthrow apartheid. They did something more important. They changed what people believed was possible. When the strike ended, the machine started again. Ships were loaded, furnaces were lit, shift whistles blew. From the outside, it appeared that order had returned. But inside the factories and inside the workers themselves, something had changed permanently. Silence no longer meant submission. Workers returned with new knowledge, and this knowledge did not vanish when wages resumed. It traveled home, into hostels, into churches, into conversations that would now be very different than they were before. One of the most significant consequences of the Durban strikes was the emergence of organic leadership. No professional politicians, not appointed representatives. Workers who had explained demands, kept order, negotiated informally, prevented violence. These individuals were noticed, but by fellow workers and by employers. Leadership had resurfaced without permission. In the months after January 1973, workers began asking a new question: How do we do this again, but better? They met after hours. They shared experiences across factories. They discussed constitutions and subscriptions. This was slow work, deliberate work. It did not look revolutionary. It looked administrative, but that made it durable. Out of the process emerged a new labor movement, independent, work-controlled, non-racial in practice. By the mid-1970s, these efforts were crystallized into federations such as Federation of South African Trade Unions. Their core principles came directly from Durban: mandated leadership, worker education, discipline over spectacle, and organization over spontaneity. Durban was proof of concept. Unions prioritize education, not slogans, not ideology, but understanding contracts, learning rights and risks, and practicing collective decision making. This education mattered beyond the workplace. It trained people in procedure, accountability, and collective governance. These skills would later migrate into civics, youth organizations, and community structures. The apartheid state did not ignore these developments. Of course they didn't. They were always checking everybody out. Security branch files from the mid-1970s show growing attention to labor organizations, not because they were violent, but because they were effective. It obviously presented them with a new problem. This was not armed struggle, no underground cells, no band organization. It was legal workplaces, ordinary workers, which you needed, and calm collective action. The strike revealed the apartheid's greatest vulnerability was dependence. The economy needed labor that could now think collectively. The skills learned in factories did not stay there. 1973 had supplied the grammar of mass organization. Others would supply the vocabulary. Years later, when the state turned to assassination, these were the people it targeted. And Durban explains why. The Durban strikes did not announce a revolution, it rehearsed one. They taught ordinary people how to act together without permission. They showed that dignity could be organized. Workers who had struck returned to towns and rural areas across the country, and they carried methods, not manifestos. As we spoke about, is mandated leadership, collective decision-making, calm enforcement, and strategic restraint. These were portable skills. They could be applied anywhere people face injustice, which meant everywhere. By the late 1970s, labor skills appeared in unexpected places. Rent committees used meeting procedures learned in factory floors. Transport boycotts adopted union discipline. School protests borrowed marshals and mandates. This was not coincidence, it was transfer. Durban had trained organizers without naming it. The apartheid state could crush crowds. It struggled with coherent communities. Discipline prevented provocation. Mandates prevented splintering. Collective decision-making prevented co-option. These features denied the state its favorite tools: divide and rule, infiltrate, and pretext for force. Organization had learned how to survive. As the 1980s approached, civic organization multiplied. They did not declare themselves revolutionary. They solved problems. They organized refuse collection. They negotiated services. They enforced boycotts. This was Durban logic applied to daily life. The state recognized the pattern and feared it. By the early 1980s, these strands converged: labor discipline, civic organization, youth energy, and church legitimacy. What emerged was not a party. It was a front, broad, decentralized, and durable. These conversions would soon be named the United Democratic Front. But its DNA was older. It had been forged in places like Durban. So security planners understood lineage. They traced organizations across sectors. They noticed familiar practices: mandates, marshals, boycott, discipline. They understood that Durban 1973 had solved a problem resistance movements usually face: how to act together without chaos. This insight changed state strategy. If organization depended on people who could do what they achieved in Durban, then repression had to change. Crowds could be dispersed. Organization could be removed. It was not ideology, it was administrative. And it would shape the violence of the late 1980s. The most ethical organizations became the most dangerous. Those who restrain violence, those who stabilize communities, those who prevent chaos. Disproved apartheid's justification for control, which made them intolerable. Durban helps us understand this paradox. Years later, when organizers in Eastern Cape were mocked, abducted, and killed, the logic did not appear suddenly. It was a precedent. It was memory. It had a genealogy that runs straight through Durban. This episode ends before names, but the road is visible. The Durban strikes left behind a method of resistance, a culture of discipline, a belief in collective power, a template for mass organization. They also left behind a warning that states which refuse reform eventually choose elimination. Durban 1973 was the first domino. It did not fall loudly. It fell correctly. And once it fell, everything else became possible and dangerous. Thank you so much for joining me today on this episode. I think you can understand why I really enjoyed this strikes, because when you think strikes, you think uproar, you think, chanting, slogans, all these things. And it was anything but. And these people prevailed. And from there, that information was taken back and then it grew and it became something that people could replicate and get better at. Okay, come back next week. Ooh, I'm doing the period from between the Durban Uprising and the Civil War to 1976. It's always interesting to look at those because you start seeing leaders emerging and that directly leads you back to the events that then happened on those days, June 16th. Okay, so that's all be next week. Bye.